Hi, I'm Mark Houston, the regular host of Doc Talk, but today I'm just here to introduce this special episode of Doc Talk Live, recorded in front of a live audience at the Matthews Opera House in Spearfish. This event features Dr. Andrew VanOsdol, a board-certified bariatric surgeon and obesity medicine specialist with Monument Health. He's here to discuss obesity, surgical weight loss, and answer real questions from the community. You may recognize Dr. VanOsdol from previous Doc Talk episodes on reflux, stomach pain, and weight loss, but this time he's live and in person. Here's Doc Talk Live with Dr. Andrew VanOsdol.
So I thought we'd just start by my goal was, there's a few things that I kind of wish everybody knew about weight loss. And so if people don't ask questions, I can promise you I can talk for hours, longer than you want to sit here. But to start off with, I thought we'd just open it up to questions and kind of dig right into it and see what people want to talk about. So does anybody have any burning questions or some meme that they saw that they thought looked cool and want to talk about?
All GLP-1s are all over social media.
Yeah, so GLP-1s is a huge topic. It's a great topic. GLP-1s, kind of what are the different sources of them, payment options, and how effective are they, right? They were easier to get up until just recently, and part of that was because of this Emergency Use Act. So because there was such a short supply of GLP-1s, anybody could compound them or kind of make them. Any pharmacist could do that and sell them to you. So they could do it a little bit cheaper. But the problem with that was that there were a lot of internet compound pharmacies that sprung up overnight just to make GLP-1s. And you might have heard some about that. Like, well, you don't know what you're getting. There was one university that actually ordered a bunch of these and studied them. Some of them were, in fact, fairly consistent with what they said they were selling. One of them was just straight insulin, not even a GLP-1 at all, which if you know anything about medicines, knowing that, that's downright dangerous. So you do have to be a little bit careful when you're buying compounded medicines, not from a specified pharmaceutical source. And even if, they say that they're verified on the internet, sometimes it's hard for you to know that. So using a third-party verification, if you are doing a compounding, is really important. Although now most of those have been shut down because that emergency use is gone. So basically what's happened is the major pharmaceutical companies in the country have kind of caught up with demand, and you can get them through verified sources easier. And so that Emergency Use Act has gone away. And so now just the pharmacy down the street can't compound those and sell them, or anybody can't compound them and sell them as a GLP-1. GLP-1s in general, just so that they're a very interesting medication. They were originally designed as an a diabetic medication, right? So they help lower your blood sugar. They're actually, they do a number of different things. One of the biggest things is they kind of delay gastric emptying a little bit. They help with satiety. They're a natural hormone that's released by the small intestine when you eat a meal, and most specifically when you eat a carbohydrate meal, a sugary meal. Okay. So they actually help to sensitize your body to insulin. So they help with diabetes, not by actually being insulin itself, not by actually helping in the uptake of sugar, but by making your body's cells more sensitive to that insulin. And then they also help with satiety, which is kind of that satisfaction that you get after eating. So that's mostly how they work. They can kind of decrease appetite in those ways and make it so that you're more satisfied from less food. That's kind of the general idea. They work very well. They're extremely effective, the most effective medication realistically that we've come up with so far for weight loss. There's one that's just coming out on the market that's an oral, but right now the only available ones are injectable. The best we can do is injecting once a week, which some people get a little squeamish about, but it's not bad. People that inject themselves with insulin get very used to it. So kind of as far as effectiveness goes, you can expect to lose, depending on kind of which variation you're doing, up to 20%. It's a huge topic. I'll say it's really hard to get insurance to cover it. They're still very expensive. Even though the Emergency Use Act has gone away, very few insurance companies realistically are covering it. If you are diabetic, because they're approved for diabetes, we can sometimes get them approved. I won't say often, approved realistic, kind of saying they're for diabetes, but using them at a higher dose. So there are some ways that we can get around that. But if your insurance policy doesn't have bariatric coverage, and you can check your insurance policy or even just call your insurance company and ask what your plan covers, they'll tell you pretty upfront whether or not they're covered. And by and large, not a lot of insurance companies are covering them, and they're very expensive out of pocket. So if you don't have diabetes and you call your insurance company and they say they're not covered, there's really not much I can do as far as other than you paying out of pocket. The problem with those medications and the problem with weight loss in general, so this is going to go back, kind of take a step backwards to talking about just weight loss in general. Whenever we talk to people about weight loss, we don't just want to help them lose weight, right? We want to help them lose fat and keep or build muscle mass. And that is really, really important to remember. Whatever form of weight loss you're going into, you don't just want to lose weight. That shouldn't be your goal. Your goal should be to be healthier, to lose fat and keep muscle, okay? If all you do is take a GLP-1 and you don't change anything else in your life, you're going to end up losing a lot of muscle mass. And unfortunately, that's a verified fact. And when I talk to people about surgery, I talk to them about this idea of, with surgery, I can almost guarantee you're going to lose, 80, 100, 120 pounds in the next year, okay? Right now, if you think of, so the ways that we maintain muscle mass, the ways that we build muscle mass are making sure that we're getting enough protein and exercise. Exercise is the single most important thing that we can do for weight maintenance. And the big deal for that is the majority of our exercise, and I'm using the E word. We're not supposed to use that word, but I'm using it. The majority of our exercise comes from living daily life, right? At the end of this visit, you're all going to stand up and you're going to walk out to your car. You're going to squat your body weight. You're going to carry it with you. Now, if you're 100 pounds overweight, that means you're living life with this 100-pound pack on. You go out and mow your lawn. You're mowing your lawn while carrying 100 pounds on your back. You get up and you go to the bathroom. You're squatting 100 pounds and you're carrying it with you to the bathroom. Your muscles are actually having to do a lot of work. You're getting a lot of exercise, just living your daily life. Now, all of a sudden, you lose that 100 pounds, but you don't change anything else in your life. What do you think is going to happen to your muscle? It's going to waste away. You're not using it anymore. It's going to atrophy. So if you just do nothing else and you start taking a GLP-1, I guarantee you'll lose weight. I won't guarantee you'll lose weight, but I can promise you you'll probably lose weight. The problem is, though, that if you don't change your lifestyle and you don't add any exercise in, you're going to lose a lot of that weight and muscle mass. And then a year down the road, when you can't afford that GLP-1 anymore because it's really expensive, or your insurance stops covering it and you come off of it, now you've unfortunately lost a lot of muscle mass and your body is going to want to go back up to that weight it was before. So taking kind of another step back, we talk sometimes about this body weight set point. So your body is always fighting to get back up to its weight. You take that, it is a hormone problem. That's why GLP-1s work. You take that away and now your body is going to want to go back up to that weight. But now you've lost muscle mass, and so it's going to put back on fat. So a year down the road, oftentimes these people do lose weight, but they've lost a lot of muscle mass. They come off their GLP-1. A year after that, they've gained their weight back, only now they have more fat mass and less muscle mass. So in the long run, it can be really detrimental. So it's really, really important to understand just going online. And that's one of the reasons that we hated these compound pharmacies that were online, not just because some of them weren't even selling you the product that they said they were, but also without good counseling, without changing anything else in your life, you can actually hurt yourself in the long run rather than helping yourself.
So kind of along the same lines, but also one of the new things that's out there, if you have a thyroid condition, hypothyroidism, and you're taking a drug that's only addressing one of the T's, now they're saying that can impact weight gain, weight loss. So what's thoughts on that?
So yeah, thyroid supplementation is a great topic in and of itself. I'll just say this person I know talked to me once about thyroid medication. This was a long time ago. And his wife they called it hypothermic euthyroidism. And so I looked into this and I found one study out there with a total of 9 patients in it that was published by some Caribbean university. And basically what they did is they gave people thyroid hormone and then they monitor them. And lo and behold, these people lost weight and they had more energy. It was amazing. And so I told him, well, I could also give her some methamphetamines and I guarantee you she would feel better and she would lose weight. But do you think that's a good idea? So the point is that just because something feels good doesn't mean it's good for you, right? And thyroid medication is very much that way. Yes, if we give somebody thyroid medication, and you can talk about kind of the different types, T3 or T4 or whatever, but for the most part, we can supplement those things. And there's a lot of these things that are out there, that a lot of these fads and memes, that endocrine as a specialty is very, very important. And there's a lot of people that need those hormones. Testosterone is another one but they can also be very easily abused because they will make you feel better, guaranteed. But that doesn't mean they're what's best for you in the long run. And that's another one that I just think with thyroid medication, you have to be really careful of. I don't think we know enough realistically to be able to say for sure on some of these, like the differences between the T3 and the T4 and what really, if somebody has a slightly low TSH or a normal TSH, but maybe their free T4 is a little bit on the low side. I don't think we realistically have enough information to know whether or not that person needs supplement and whether or not it's really good for them in the long run. And I'd just be really, really hesitant to take any of those things myself unless you have a really known problem. So if you're seeing an endocrinologist and they're telling you, yes, these hormones are off and this is going to benefit you, I would trust that person. We have very good endocrinologists actually in the Black Hills area. But if your kind of levels are all normal and somebody's telling you, well, it's borderline and if we give you a little bit of this, it'll help, I would be skeptical. There is a lot of nuance to it and it's really hard, but I'll just kind of say it's one of those that if you're seeing an endocrinologist and they're telling you that they think you should be supplemented, I would believe them. Absolutely. If you're seeing anybody other than a specialty trained endocrinologist and they're telling you need thyroid hormone, I'd be skeptical. And just because it makes you feel better doesn't mean it's good for you and doesn't mean it's beneficial in the long run. So the most common surgeries for weight loss in this country has been the sleeve gastrectomy for quite a while. The Roux-en-Y gastric bypass is still considered the gold standard. It's been around as a standalone procedure for much, much longer. It was the most common procedure in the country until the late 2000s when the lap adjustable gastric band had its heyday, kind of took over for a little while. And then the sleeve gastrectomy took over from that as the band went down. And the sleeve has been going strong for quite a while. Nationwide, it's about 60 to 65% of the bariatric surgeries performed in this country are sleeve gastrectomies. About 40% are the gastric bypass. In our program, we're a little bit flipped from that. We're about 60% Roux-en-Y gastric bypass and 40% sleeve gastrectomy. I think there's a lot of different reasons for that, but one of the big reasons for that is that we see a lot of people with reflux. That's because I also do a lot of reflux surgery. A lot of people enter our program with reflux as their primary complaint. And then we kind of say, look, this is a weight problem as well as a reflux problem, and fixing your weight is going to help your reflux. And the bypass realistically is very good at treating both reflux. And then I told it was actually originally designed kind of as an anti-reflux type procedure. And then they found that it had this side effect of weight loss that kind of became its main, for various reasons, main purpose. And now that's what people think of it as, but it's a very good reflux surgery too. So the sleeve gastrectomy, if you think of your stomach as kind of this, basically we go to the esophagus, turns into the stomach, and then the small intestine, and then the colon, right? So the esophagus comes down in the stomach. Usually your stomach is a couple liter sized, kind of very expandable pouch, okay? The vertical sleeve gastrectomy is a surgery where we basically put a tube into the stomach and kind of size it, make a banana shape out of what used to be a balloon. Okay, so basically decrease the size of the stomach fairly significantly. The Roux-en-Y gastric bypass, we actually cut across the very first part of the stomach. So we disconnect the stomach. We leave kind of just about a quarter up top and then 3/4 down below. And then we actually go down to the small intestine and bring a limb of the small intestine up and hook it to that pouch. So now food is going to come down, go right into that top small part of the stomach, and then empty right into the small intestine. So it bypasses the majority of the stomach and the very first part of the small intestine. Those surgeries are, we used to tell people when I was in med school, they told me that the gastric bypass works because we're making your stomach a lot smaller. So we call that restriction. We're restricting the amount of food you can eat. and we're bypassing part of the intestine. It's a restrictive and malabsorptive procedure because we're bypassing that part of the intestine. That part of the intestine doesn't see food anymore. The small intestine is really what absorbs calories. If you're small intestine, you don't have as much small intestine, then theoretically you just wouldn't absorb as many calories. Interestingly, they started doing studies on this, and what they found is that making that pouch bigger or smaller didn't actually change how much weight people lost. And also bypassing more or less of the intestine, again, didn't really change how much weight people lost. So you'd think if this was working by restriction and malabsorption, that changing those variables would change how much weight people lost. So we kind of went back to the drawing board, and that's really when we figured out that GLP-1s, what that hormone does and how it works. What we found is that by bypassing that part of the stomach, the stomach makes a hormone called ghrelin, which is a hunger hormone. And when it gets bypassed, it kind of goes into a fasting state, and it doesn't make as much of that ghrelin. So you get less hunger hormone. And then when sugars and carbohydrates, like I said, hit the small intestine releases this hormone called GLP-1. And so what we see is that food hits the small intestine a lot faster because we're bypassing the stomach and we're bypassing the first part of the small intestine that doesn't release that GLP-1. So food hits that small intestine much faster, which causes this big increase in GLP-1. Okay, so you get more of that satiety or satisfaction after eating. So that's really how those surgeries work. The fascinating thing about it, and this is, I'm going to take one step back here because weight loss in general, I kind of talked about this idea of a body weight set point, right? So we've kind of come to see that people want to weigh what they weigh. Okay, it's like the thermostat in your house. If the temperature drops, you set your heat to 72 degrees or 70 degrees, the temperature drops below that, the heater kicks on and warms it back up. So your body kind of wants to weigh what it does. If your body starts to dip below its set point, it'll actually fight to get back up there. So one of the things it does is it makes you feel more hungry, right? So you go on a diet, and especially those first few days, you just feel like you could eat anything, right? And then the next thing it does is a little bit more deceptive. It actually decreases the number of calories that you're burning. Okay, so without you even knowing it, without you being able to do anything about it, your body becomes more efficient. You go from being a Suburban to a Prius, all right? And when that happens, you are burning fewer calories. So even though you're eating fewer calories, you're not burning as many. So you're not going to lose as much weight. And so we've actually studied this in a number of different ways. And what we find is that, we used to tell people, well, to lose weight, all you got to do is exercise more and eat less, right? And we tell people even there's this 3,500 calorie rule. So there's 3,500 calories in 1 pound of fat. So if you have a 3,500 calorie deficit, theoretically, you will lose 1 pound. Okay, so that means 500 calories a day. So if you exercise more and eat less by 500 calories a day, you will lose 3,500 calories a week. You'll lose a pound a week, right? It's beautiful. You just simple math. So then in a year, you do that, you'll lose 50 pounds. Great. What happens is you maintain that 500 calorie a day deficit. That first week, you will lose about a pound. The next week, you'll lose a little less than a pound, a little less than a pound. And then you get to the point where you've lost about 20 pounds and you'll actually start gaining weight back. Okay. So without you changing anything. And what happens normally is people then go, well, screw it. Why am I doing this anymore? So then they go back to eating and doing what they were doing before. And now they gain their weight back, only their body's a little bit more efficient than it used to be. So they gain their weight back plus some. So we see that yo-yo diet effect, really, really common. With surgery, we actually see people lose weight 1 year after surgery with hormonal surgery. So the Roux-en-Y gastric bypass being the best example of that, or most studied example of that, I'll say. 1 year after surgery, people have lost weight and their body is actually reset that set point so that they're not trying to gain weight back anymore. They're burning the same number of calories as other people do based on age and weight match controls. Okay. There's a great study. I won't go into the whole thing, but it was actually done with the Biggest Loser TV show contestants. And they followed those contestants for 7 years and they brought them all back and they redid this testing. And that's what they found was that 7 years down the road, their bodies were still fighting, trying to get back up to their original weight. Part of why the bypass is so great at controlling reflux, because acid is made in that distal part of the stomach. So now there's really not much acid up in that upper pouch to come back up anymore. And so those things still come and meet up with the food further down the line. Another great example of that. So they did this other, for a while, we were doing this Roux-en-Y gastric bypass, but they called it a banded Roux-en-Y gastric bypass. So when they did the bypass, they would make that anastomosis as tight as possible. So this is when they thought it worked by restriction. And the theory was, well, we're going to keep people from being able to eat more. We're going to restrict them even more. So they actually made that anastomosis really tight so that food couldn't make it through and into the small intestine as quickly. Okay, now, knowing what you guys know now, you can see right away this is a bad idea, right? Because we want food hitting that small intestine faster, not slower. And sure enough, these people lost weight for the first year, but they ended up not being able to eat protein as well. And they typically lost more muscle mass than people who didn't have a banded gastroplasty or gastric bypass. And then after a year, they started gaining their weight back, actually, rather than keeping it off the way that the unbanded gastric bypass patients do. So again, it speaks to this idea of this is working through hormone changes, not necessarily restriction and malabsorption. One of the interesting things about those studies where they looked at making that pouch bigger and smaller. So I'll go ahead and just give you the whole spiel. If we make that pouch bigger, it actually doesn't change, like I said, realistically, how much weight people lose. What it does change is it actually increases their risk of complications. It increases the risk of a leak, of having a problem with that anastomosis, and even ulcerations down the road. Part of the theory of that is that it increases the number of acid-producing cells in that upper part of the stomach. So I said we want the acid-producing cells in the bottom part. We don't want them in that top part. So we still do make that pouch really small, not because it necessarily helps much with weight loss, but because it reduces the risk of complications, long-term and short-term, okay? And then when we looked at, like I said, making that small intestine limb longer or shorter, so bypassing more, so making it so that there's more wasted or not used intestine or less, didn't change necessarily how much weight people lost, but it did really increase complications. So by bypassing more intestine, the more intestine we bypass, the higher risk there is going to be that you're going to have problems with absorption. And then we start running into more iron deficiencies or vitamin deficiencies, mineral deficiencies, things like that. By keeping those limb lengths relatively short, we can actually decrease the risk of those long-term complications and not significantly change how much weight people lose. So we do recommend that people take multivitamins, iron, calcium supplements after having a gastric bypass or a sleeve gastrectomy. The reality is, though, that risk is pretty low. Not saying that it's zero, but as long as you're taking those medications, it's actually less than what your risk would be right now. Interestingly, obesity itself puts your body in this chronic inflammatory state. So obesity itself is a risk factor for iron deficiency and a lot of vitamin and mineral deficiencies. And so the reality is that, and especially living in our climate, I'll use vitamin D as the example. I mean, come March, pretty much everybody that we test is vitamin D deficient, whether you've had a bypass or not. And those are so those are things that realistically we should all be thinking about. The reality is, for most of us, if we're eating a well-balanced diet, so I'm gonna kind of switch that a little bit and talk something else that I'm passionate about. It's kind of whole foods, real foods. If we're getting the majority of our calories through real foods, right? Things that you could more or less find in nature or grow in your backyard. The reality is that most of us don't need those things, don't need any form of supplementation, right? Maybe if you're an elite athlete, okay, maybe there'd be some benefit to you getting some of these supplements. But for the vast majority of people, if we just ate what we were supposed to, you wouldn't see any of those problems.
Thanks so much for joining us for this special edition of Doc Talk Live. We appreciate you spending your time with us and hope you found today's conversation informative and inspiring. Don't miss our next Doc Talk Live event, Monday, July 21st at 5:30 at the historic Matthews Opera House. Dr. Lauren Jones will be discussing new treatments for sleep apnea, especially for those who can't tolerate traditional CPAP machines. He'll be focusing on Inspire Therapy, a breakthrough mask-free solution that's helping patients sleep and breathe better. Until next time, stay well, stay informed, and thanks for listening to Doc Talk with Monument Health.